Old Hollywood has always carried a certain glow. The red carpets, the flashing cameras, the movie stars that seemed larger than life. The studio system painted these icons as untouchable, flawless beings. They weren't just beautiful, they were presented as brilliant, refined, and sophisticated. But that was the illusion. Behind the perfect lighting and scripted interviews, many of the stars we now consider legends were hiding a very different truth. Some of them were dazzling on screen but shockingly naive, gullible, or downright clueless when the cameras stopped rolling. And we're not just talking about a few funny mistakes here and there. These were stars who could captivate millions worldwide while at the same time asking if Easter happened in December, if Vikings were made up like dragons, or if Africa was just a city you could drive through. For audiences, they looked like gods and goddesses. In reality, many of them struggled with the most basic concepts of geography, money, history, or even human relationships. Some were manipulated out of fortunes because they didn't understand contracts. Others asked questions so baffling that even their co-stars wondered if it was a joke, only to realize they were completely serious. And yet, here's the irony. These same stars could bring a story to life in ways that made audiences laugh, cry, and believe in magic. Their charisma and presence were so powerful that intelligence didn't seem to matter. Hollywood didn't want thinkers. It wanted faces, it wanted energy, and it wanted control. For the studios, a star who asked too many questions was a problem. A star who didn't understand much at all? Perfect. So today, we're pulling back the curtain on 10 beloved Hollywood icons who may have been talented, glamorous, and unforgettable, but who also revealed a side of themselves that was far less polished. From comedy geniuses who couldn't manage their own money, to dramatic stars who didn't understand the very scripts they performed, these stories prove that fame and brilliance don't always go hand in hand. 1. Jerry Lewis, the comedy genius who couldn't escape. Chaos. Jerry Lewis is remembered as one of the greatest comedy legends of all time. He was the master of slapstick, the wild energy behind classics like The Nutty Professor and The Bellboy. Audiences adored him. His timing, his expressions, his voice. Everything about him screamed comic genius. On screen, he looked unstoppable, but off-screen, Jerry Lewis was often his own worst enemy. For someone who could choreograph chaos in a way that felt brilliant, Jerry struggled to manage even the most basic parts of his own life. He earned millions during his career, but financial responsibility was never his strong suit. Managers and accountants described him as reckless with money, throwing fortunes into business schemes that collapsed almost as soon as they started. He once tried to run his own production company, convinced he could outsmart the studios, only to run it straight into financial disaster. His behavior was just as unpredictable as his comedy. Co-stars and directors described him as brilliant one moment and impossible to work with the next. Jerry would explode with anger at the smallest mistake on set, storming out of meetings or alienating colleagues who just wanted to help him succeed. That legendary temper created as many enemies as it did fans. And when it came to his personal decisions, they were often just as chaotic as his slapstick routines. Jerry admitted to cheating on his wife throughout their marriage, making choices that left his personal life as messy as his business ventures. His image was that of a fun-loving goofball, but behind closed doors, there was a man making mistake after mistake, unable to recognize when his own actions were tearing things apart. The irony of Jerry Lewis is that he was a man who could control comedy down to the smallest detail. Every pratfall, every exaggerated gesture, every carefully timed gag was calculated for maximum laughs. But in the real world, he couldn't control his impulses, his finances, or even his relationships. For fans, he was the genius clown. For insiders, he was a reminder that brilliance in one area doesn't always translate to wisdom in life. 2. Mickey Rooney, the star who couldn't grasp reality. Mickey Rooney was once Hollywood's golden boy. In the 1930s and 40s, he wasn't just a star, he was the star. At one point, Mickey was the #1 box office draw in the world, beloved for his role in the Andy Hardy films and for his energetic musicals alongside Judy Garland. On screen, he was quick, clever, and full of life. But when the cameras weren't rolling, Mickey Rooney often lived in a world of his own making, a world that had little connection to reality. Directors and crew members said Mickey had a habit of completely misunderstanding how films were made. Even well into his adult career, he didn't seem to grasp that movies were shot out of sequence. If a director filmed the ending before the beginning, Mickey would get genuinely confused and ask how audiences were supposed to follow a story told backwards. Imagine being in Hollywood for decades and still not understanding the very basics of filmmaking. That was Mickey. His disconnect didn't stop there. During a USO tour in the 1940s, Mickey reportedly asked if Germany and Japan were the same country, since America was fighting both in World War II. When someone tried to explain the difference, Mickey grew frustrated, insisting there must only be one enemy because it's too complicated otherwise. It wasn't a joke. He truly believed it. And financially, Mickey was a disaster. Despite earning millions across his lifetime, he filed for bankruptcy multiple times. His own accountants said he simply couldn't understand concepts like fixed expenses. Mickey would argue, "If I'm not working this month, why would I still have to pay my mortgage?" No matter how many times it was explained to him, he just couldn't process it. But perhaps the strangest part of Mickey's life was his relationship with his own career. Even after his fame had faded and he was only getting small supporting roles, Mickey would talk as if major starring projects were being developed just for him. He'd tell friends and co-stars about meetings with studio executives that never happened, and roles he claimed were written with him in mind. It wasn't lying. It seemed like he truly believed his own fantasies. The Mickey Rooney the public saw was a whirlwind of talent. A man who could sing, dance, and act his way into America's heart. But the Mickey behind the curtain was often a man lost in his own illusions, unable to separate the fantasy of Hollywood from the reality of life. 3. Judy Garland, a voice of gold, but gullible to the core. Few stars in Hollywood history shine brighter than Judy Garland. From the moment she sang "Somewhere Over the Rainbow" in The Wizard of Oz, she was immortalized as a legend. Her voice could stop an audience in its tracks, and her emotional depth on screen made her unforgettable. But away from the spotlight, Judy was far more fragile than the confident star her fans adored, and at times surprisingly naive. Her education had been cut short when she signed with MGM at just 13 years old. Instead of real schooling, Judy was given studio tutors who were more focused on satisfying child labor laws than teaching her anything useful. By the time she became a global star, she had glaring gaps in her knowledge that sometimes shocked the people around her. One famous story involved the holiday Easter. While filming Easter Parade, Judy reportedly asked the director when Easter was. When told it always fell in spring, she became confused and asked why it wasn't in December with the other holidays. She was completely serious. Her gullibility was perhaps her most dangerous flaw. Friends and co-workers said you could tell Judy just about anything and she'd believe it. A makeup artist once joked, "You could tell her that drinking grapefruit juice while standing on one foot would keep her young forever, and she'd believe it completely." This blind trust made her an easy target for the people around her, particularly the doctors and studio handlers who pushed endless pills on her. Judy rarely questioned what she was given, and that blind faith fed directly into the addiction issues that would haunt her for life. Math and finances were another struggle. Judy could earn millions but had no idea how to manage them. Her business manager recalled trying to explain that 10% of $100,000 was $10,000, only for Judy to stare blankly, unable to grasp it. She could sing like no one else alive, but percentages and contracts were beyond her. What makes Judy's story so heartbreaking is the contrast. On stage and on screen, she had a wisdom and emotional intelligence that seemed far beyond her years. She could make audiences feel everything. But in her personal life, she was often childlike, vulnerable, and dependent on others, many of whom took advantage of her innocence. Judy Garland will forever be remembered as a voice that defined an era. But behind the songs and the smiles was a woman who never got the chance to truly grow up, leaving her easy to manipulate and heartbreakingly unprepared for the harsh realities of Hollywood. 4. Tony Curtis, Hollywood's handsome but hopelessly confused heartthrob. Tony Curtis was the kind of star Hollywood loved to create. With his striking looks, effortless charm, and smooth voice, he quickly rose to fame in the 1950s and 60s. Audiences swooned over him in films like Some Like It Hot and Spartacus. On screen, he seemed confident, witty, and even sophisticated. But behind the camera, Tony Curtis was often just repeating words without ever understanding what he was saying. Directors who worked with him said Tony had a gift for memorizing lines. He could nail an entire page of dialogue word for word with perfect timing. The problem? He had no idea what those words meant. One director recalled Tony finishing a brilliant take, turning to him and then asking, "So, what did I just say?" He was, as one insider put it, like a very talented parrot. His gaps in knowledge could be jaw-dropping. While filming The Vikings, Tony reportedly asked his co-star Kirk Douglas if Vikings were real, or if they were just made-up creatures like dragons. At first, Douglas thought Tony was joking, but he quickly realized he wasn't. He had to spend lunch breaks giving Curtis history lessons just so he'd understand what movie they were making. Geography wasn't much better. During production of The Great Race, Tony repeatedly asked the director which highways they would take to drive from America to France. The director had to explain over and over that there's an ocean in between. Curtis just didn't get it. And when it came to finances? Disaster. Despite earning millions, Tony often lost money to laughably bad investments. His business manager recalled one infamous incident. Tony invested $50,000 in a plan to import sand to Hawaii because someone told him the islands were running out of beach sand. He never even asked to see a business plan. Yet, somehow, Tony's career thrived. That's the strange thing. While he lacked formal education and common sense, he had an undeniable charisma that audiences couldn't resist. His emotional intelligence and performance helped him connect with people, even if his intellectual intelligence left much to be desired. Tony Curtis may have been confused about history, geography, and money, but he wasn't confused about how to win over an audience. And that, more than anything else, is what made him a star. 5. Jane Mansfield, the genius who asked. If the moon was the sun. Jane Mansfield was the original Hollywood bombshell of the 1950s and 60s. With her platinum blonde hair, hourglass figure, and larger-than-life personality, she was often compared to Marilyn Monroe. And in some ways, she leaned even harder into the dumb blonde stereotype that made her famous. But here's the twist. Jane Mansfield actually claimed to be a genius. She boasted an IQ of 163 and insisted she spoke 5 different languages. At face value, it sounded impressive. A bombshell beauty who was secretly brilliant. The reality, however, was much stranger. People who worked with her said Jane would sometimes show off by quoting philosophers or referencing great works of literature. But when pressed, it quickly became obvious she didn't actually understand what she was talking about. Once, she even attributed a Nietzsche quote to the cartoon character Betty Boop. And she wasn't joking. Her gaps in basic science were even more shocking. A makeup artist recalled Jane once asking if the sun and the moon were the same thing, just appearing at different times of day. She was dead serious. Another time, she asked if drinking hydrogen peroxide would make her organs blonde. When told it could actually kill her, she seemed surprised and casually admitted she had already tried it. Jane also had a dangerous misunderstanding of money. Despite making large sums, she couldn't tell the difference between gross and net income. If she was paid $50,000 for a movie, she'd immediately spend $75,000 convinced the money would somehow balance itself out. But perhaps the strangest thing about Jane Mansfield was how much she leaned into her own confusion as part of her persona. She deliberately played up the dumb blonde act because it got her publicity, acting clueless in interviews, exaggerating her mistakes for laughs. The problem was that she blurred the line so often between the act and her real self, even people close to her weren't sure how much of it was real. Behind the glamorous photo shoots and over-the-top publicity stunts was a woman who may have had raw intelligence on paper, but whose real-life decisions, from bizarre questions to reckless financial mistakes, painted a very different picture. 6. Errol Flynn, the swashbuckler who couldn't read a map. Errol Flynn was the ultimate swashbuckler. In films like Captain Blood and The Adventures of Robin Hood, he was dashing, charming, and quick-witted. On screen, he always had the perfect comeback and a heroic confidence that made him unforgettable. But the man behind the sword was far less sharp than the characters he played. People who worked with him often said Errol was shockingly ignorant about even the most basic things. One script supervisor revealed he couldn't even locate Europe on a map, which is especially ironic considering he was born in Tasmania, spent years in England, and traveled extensively before ever reaching Hollywood. Despite all of that, geography remained a complete mystery to him. His education had been spotty at best. Expelled from multiple schools as a young man, Errol never really completed formal studies. But what stood out wasn't just the lack of schooling, it was his complete lack of interest in ever improving himself. Directors and writers who worked with him admitted they often had to rewrite his dialogue, removing any words longer than 2 syllables, not because he couldn't pronounce them, but because he simply didn't understand what they meant. This lack of comprehension caused constant problems on set. Flynn would often put the emphasis on the wrong words in a line, completely changing the meaning, because he didn't understand what he was actually saying. Retakes were endless. Even his autobiography, My Wicked, Wicked Ways, wasn't really his. It was ghostwritten because Errol couldn't put together coherent paragraphs. The ghostwriter later admitted that half the time, Flynn didn't even remember the events he was supposed to be recounting, sometimes questioning whether they had even happened. And yet, Hollywood adored him. The man who couldn't follow simple dialogue or understand geography was the same man who played some of the most charismatic and intelligent heroes of the silver screen. One infamous moment sums him up perfectly. While talking with the director, Flynn reportedly asked if New York was in California. When corrected, he asked if California was in New York. For fans, Errol Flynn was the clever rogue who could outthink any villain. But for those who knew him off-screen, he was often just stumbling through life, relying on charm and looks rather than knowledge or reason. 7. Bela Lugosi, Dracula, lost in his own fantasy. Bela Lugosi gave the world one of the most iconic performances in film history, Count Dracula. His deep voice, piercing stare, and aristocratic presence made audiences believe in the terrifying allure of vampires. To this day, his version of Dracula is legendary. But the truth behind the actor was very different. Off-screen, Bela Lugosi often struggled to understand even the basics, and sometimes he couldn't separate himself from the character that made him famous. Language was part of the problem. Bela never fully mastered English, even after decades in America. On set, he memorized his lines phonetically. That's why they always sounded so precise and eerie. The problem was, he often didn't understand what the words actually meant. If someone asked him to paraphrase his dialogue or explain what his character was saying, he'd look completely lost. But his difficulties went deeper than language. Directors noticed that even when things were explained to him in Hungarian, Bela struggled with reasoning and story logic. One producer remembered a bizarre incident. They had to spend 3 hours explaining why his character couldn't appear in scenes after being killed. Bela argued, "But I am Dracula." Dracula cannot die. He was completely serious. His lack of understanding extended into his finances as well. At one point, he signed away the rights to his own likeness for merchandise, for just $1,000. When those products later earned millions, Bela couldn't grasp why he wasn't getting more money, even though the contract had been explained to him. And then there were his superstitions. Crew members recalled that Lugosi believed certain furniture arrangements could summon or repel evil spirits. Once, he refused to film a scene because he thought the set had been arranged in a death pattern. When someone moved a single chair, he suddenly felt safe again. Despite his struggles, Lugosi will always be remembered as one of horror's great icons. But behind the cape and the fangs was a man who often couldn't tell the difference between fiction and reality, business and fantasy. For audiences, he was Dracula. But for those who knew him, he was a reminder that brilliance on screen can hide bewilderment in real life. 8. Lana Turner. Glamorous but clueless behind the scenes. Lana Turner was Hollywood's sweater girl, a nickname that came from her incredible figure and undeniable beauty. She embodied the glamorous blonde starlet of the 1940s and 50s. On screen, she radiated sophistication and allure, starring in classics like The Postman Always Rings Twice. But behind the glitz and glamour, Lana Turner had some surprising limitations that shocked the people who worked with her. For starters, Lana was nearly illiterate. MGM executives knew she couldn't really read scripts on her own, so they assigned her a secretary whose job was basically to do all of Lana's reading, writing, and even basic math for her. Directors often had to simplify her lines or explain plot points over and over until she could memorize what was happening. Her gaps in knowledge were sometimes astounding. During the filming of The Postman Always Rings Twice, Lana reportedly asked if Acapulco was in Italy. When told it was in Mexico, she asked if she could just drive there for the weekend from California, apparently unaware of both the distance and the fact that there was an international border in the way. Her financial understanding wasn't much better. At one point, Lana signed a contract to be paid $5,000 per week, but she didn't understand that meant a total of $5,000 for the week. She thought it meant she'd get $5,000 every single day. When her business manager explained it was the weekly amount, she argued back, insisting that per week must mean per day of the week. Despite earning enormous amounts of money as one of Hollywood's top stars, Lana burned through her fortune with reckless spending and disastrous investments. She trusted the wrong people, signed contracts without reading them, and lived as if her income would never end. Unsurprisingly, she faced money troubles throughout her career. And yet, despite all of this, directors loved working with her. Why? Because while Lana may not have understood the psychology of her characters or the fine details of a script, she could follow directions perfectly. If a director told her to cry, she'd cry. If they told her to look heartbroken, she could do it instantly, and look stunning while doing so. Lana Turner is remembered as a symbol of Golden Age Hollywood glamour, but behind the dazzling gowns and red carpets, she was a woman who didn't understand much about the world around her, and somehow that never stopped her from becoming a legend. 9. Joan Blondell, quick-witted on-screen, clueless off-screen. Joan Blondell was the definition of fast-talking charm. In the 1930s and 40s, she lit up the screen with her wisecracking humor and bubbly personality. She played the street-smart working girl in over 100 films, delivering snappy dialogue that made her sound sharper than anyone else in the room. But that was the magic of acting, because in real life, Joan's quick wit didn't always match her actual understanding of the world. Crew members and directors who worked with her were often stunned by her knowledge gaps. For example, Joan once asked if Abraham Lincoln was a real person, or just a character made up for a movie about a president. People thought she was joking, but she wasn't. Her struggles with basic math were even more shocking. Joan had a hard time with the simplest calculations. Her business manager recalled that if something cost 75 cents and she paid with $1, she couldn't figure out she was supposed to get a quarter back. She would simply hand over the money and wait for someone else to tell her the change. Even something as simple as telling time was beyond her. Well into adulthood, Joan admitted she couldn't read an analog clock. Instead of looking at the time herself, she'd just ask people around her, every single day. Her difficulties also showed up in her contracts. At one point, Joan signed a 7-year deal with Warner Brothers but thought it was for 3 years. Why? Because she miscounted the number of option years written into the paperwork. When the studio extended her contract into the 4th year, she was shocked, and insisted they'd made a mistake. Despite these limitations, Joan was resourceful in her own way. She relied on her incredible memory to cover up her weaknesses. She could memorize dialogue instantly, which helped her hide the fact that she couldn't follow a script as easily as others. She even developed little tricks, like memorizing the shape of certain dollar bills or the position of clock hands, so she could get by without doing the actual math or reading. Joan Blondell may not have been the intellectual powerhouse her characters made her seem, but she had an undeniable charisma that made audiences love her anyway. In Hollywood, sometimes charm mattered more than common sense, and Joan had plenty of it.